Okay, we're back in the book of Galatians. Galatians written in 50 to 60 approximately AD, Common Era. This is so important, guys. We're looking for the proper interpretation of the word law as it relates in the New Testament. This is part 3 of a 4-part series on 16 difficult questions that we're asking specifically in Galatians chapter 3. I would say arguably the most difficult, not even arguably, the most challenging chapter to understand what Paul was talking about. This is the catalyst by which we're doing this study. Now, before we begin, it's so important we do mention that we're using the name, we're looking for the name of the Creator. You may have seen it, YAHUHA, Vavhe, that's YHWH, Yahweh, YAHUHA, YAHUHA, in replace of the word Lord or God. Over 68 times the translators of the New Testament have replaced his name. His name is coming alive to his servants in this day. We've understood how Satan has hijacked the name of the Creator and covered it up. And it's very important to understand that the scriptures were not written in English. It's in actually the original language is in a picture form called a tetragrammaton. And we're choosing the latter here as the name of the Father and for his Son, the name above all names given to him. You may have seen Yeshua, Yahshua, Yahushua, in replace of the name Jesus that's well known in every religion across the world, and that's, again, Satan's doing. And we know the letter J, that was only invented 400 years ago, so obviously it couldn't have been J. But this is not a study on the name. It's just simply this is one slide to share the names we'll be using in this study. We'll be using the latter, and we're still in a diligent pursuit to accurately get his name. But the main thing for all of the servants in this day to understand, with the name comes an identity. And we want to get the right identity of the Creator and his Son that came 2,000 years ago. And we've inherited a lot of lies over that time. Again, this is part 3 of this study, and it's a 4-part series. In part 1, we spent 2/3 of the study on an intro to covenant, the importance, and we laid out the timeline we're going to be sharing again with you. We answered questions 1 through 3. In part 2, we also spent a lot of time on the intro to dig out some new issues, and I highly encourage you, especially after watching this study, if you haven't seen 1 or 2, please go back to 1 and 2, because it is important. I'm not going to cover many issues regarding the big picture of covenant and how it all works together as an unfolding plan from Adam to the second Adam, tightly knit together by 7 covenants the Father made through 4 individuals: Noah, Moses, and David, and of course he began it through Adam, and Adam fell. So we spent 2/3 of the study on the second one as well, and you may ask, why so much time? And the main reason is we, with all our heart's desire, we want to share with you and give you guys this revelation that through the lens of covenant, it connects and it interprets every book, every writer, every subject. You can't even go a singular verse in Scripture anywhere, and we can't show you how it relates to covenant. Covenant being a contract, also involving a relationship. Now, before I go any further, and I do want to show you part 3, I'm titling part 3, this is the study we're in tonight, part 3, I'm titling it the 2 Covenant Mystery. This is the deepest mystery I could even imagine, fathomably try to communicate, especially in this one study. But that's why we've designed many, many studies to share the breadth and depth and the extent of how, although there's 8 total covenants, there was 2 covenants. The first covenant comprised of the first 7 that was never completed because his Son had to come and die for the covenant that he made. The Son made the covenant with the Father on behalf of Abraham and his descendants. And guys, if you just stick with us, you will be so overjoyed, overflowing with love and joy for the blood covenant plan that the Father put together, that we might have the privilege to participate, but then the fear and the reverence to actually carry it out. Now, what I want to mention real quick is, in review of this material, I'm going to be going through a lot of scriptures. We're going to be looking at different time periods: Mount Sinai often, David's time often, the prophet's day often, and of course the Messiah's day. You're going to see it more or less on a big picture. If you haven't seen our covenant timeline before, I'll point it out briefly on the next couple slides. But I want to share with you, do not lose heart. I'm going to tell this like a story. I'm going to be a storyteller, put you back into the story as we're going along. And I'm saying that so I remind myself that I need to make sure I'm telling this as a story, because this is the greatest story anybody's ever told. And guess what? It's true. It's actually played out. Anybody that's put their faith in the Creator has to have some kind of belief that it's a true story, not just an allegory. The second half of this study, we're going to answer in detail questions 7 through 16. I'm so excited about this study because I'm going to now bring in the proper interpretation of many Paul's scriptures in Romans and Galatians, and we've laid a strong foundation as to what brought us up to this point. The second half of this study will be easy to answer because I've laid out the entire part of the answers in this study right now, this first half. And in part 4, after part 3, obviously, is the big picture. What was Paul dealing with? The mindset. What was the mindset of the nations? What was the mindset of the Judeans, the Jews? And what was the giant covenant issue he was facing in his day? Brothers and sisters, this is so important, which I personally don't see many, if any, properly see the gravity of the events surrounding it. It only has to do because the covenant shows us what he was dealing against. Those keeping the first covenant was vehemently against him. So as we look through the lens of covenant, it makes us see very clear what the issues are at hand, and especially as it relates to law. So one of the first questions to throw out there, Paul's writings, right? In general, did he support the law? Now, Torah people would say that for sure, unless they say he's a false prophet. There's many people that are honest with his scriptures if you read them literally, which you do need to read literally, but you have to properly interpret. They cast him out as a false prophet. Did he oppose the law? Mainstream Christianity says, yes, he absolutely opposed the law. Therefore, we're not under law. We're going to talk about under law in detail tonight, and we will see what he was saying. Or was he speaking covenant language? That's the term I have coined as covenant language. And to understand what he was writing, you need to understand the covenant he was under. Now, in Galatians chapter 3, the next question that we are going to answer in the second half of this study, we've answered questions 1 through 6 in the first 2 studies. These questions, by the way, were started by a Facebook post to challenge people if they really understand Galatians chapter 3. I laid out 16 questions, and then I started meditating and praying that we need to go through and answer those, and it's became into a series. So question 7 is the most important of all. It deals with the inheritance. What was Paul talking about in Galatians 3:16 on the inheritance? And question 8, how the inheritance doesn't depend on the law. Doesn't depend on the law. That would make you think that law, obviously, would be something you need to know is not important, right? But it is. It's important to know what he was talking about. Question number 10, that the law was added for transgressions. Question 11, that the law was added until the seed came. 13, that the law was given through angels or messengers. Question 14, that the law was entrusted to a mediator. In Galatians 3:24, it says it was the schoolmaster, the law was. And there amongst many others. We began the series with question number 1. I believe this is actually the linchpin to understand the question, all who rely on observing the law are under a curse. Obviously, whatever this law is, we don't want to be under a curse. And this is obviously where mainstream Christianity has opposed the law. In some cases, many cases, they think the law is the entire Old Testament. So let's look at that question real quick and review. This is part 1, Galatians 3:10. This was how we started the series, this question. All who rely on observing the law are under a curse. For it is written, cursed is everyone who does not continue to do everything written in the book of the law. So we have observing the law under a curse, and that is the curse is written in the book of the law. So doesn't it make sense that we come out and ask, what is the book of the law? Many times we get caught not properly reading the verse before and the verse after, or the chapter before, or the chapter after. How about in the same verse? The book of the law is actually the key to understanding what this curse is. We have found that the book of Deuteronomy is a covenant in and of itself. We're going to talk in detail about this, so no need to go any further. But that's the answer to the question. The book of Deuteronomy is the book of the law. Again, we're going to talk about that, so hang in there. So what is the book of the law? Now, we aren't going to talk about it in the detail we did in the first study. If you can access our study, join us on our Facebook page, Blood of the Eternal Covenant. We'd be happy to send you the study. In part 1, at the 1 hour and 17-minute mark, I believe I taught on 25 to 30 minutes in detail. We're going to summarize that a little bit right now, that the book of the law is the book of Deuteronomy. Here's a covenant timeline. Adam's in the beginning, and we shaped it in a running shoe incrementally, as accurate as we could, and we mapped out 8 covenants along the way. We're going to be showing you that today, but right now, Adam's in the beginning. We are here. We are 6,000 years afterwards. Covenant number 8, we label it number 8 as the blood of the eternal covenant in our Savior's blood, the Messiah. Now, there was a 40-year penalty given specifically because of the sin of the 10 spies. At the end of the 40-year period, as a direct result of that sin, was given the book of the law as a covenant that went into effect. It went into effect, and anybody living in this period of time, guys, again, from the 40 years after Mount Sinai, the book of the law was given. Joshua led the people into the land, and he was meditating on the words, you can read it, Joshua 1:8, on the words of the book of the law. He then instituted the book of the law in Joshua chapter 8. Joshua chapter 8 is following verbatim the instructions of Deuteronomy chapter 27. Deuteronomy, again, is the book of the law. Now, it's important to realize that whether you lived in Joshua's day or you lived in the days of the prophets, in David's day, or even right up to the brink of the Messiah coming, you were under this book of the law. This was a book of blessings and curses. The covenant carried curses for disobedience and blessings for obedience. And as we read over and over and over again, the people in general only disobeyed over and over again. So, with Paul writing about where that man is, we just put on the screen, there was a covenant change that took place, a drastic covenant change. It would have been, we could call it the new covenant. The people that followed the Messiah, that were born again by his Spirit on Shavuot, and those that were added daily, they were now had release from that covenant. We're going to talk in detail about this. I just thought I liked this. I just thought I'd share it in there, this phrase, but there's a new sheriff in town, and his name is the YAHUHA the Messiah. And with his blood atonement, many of us that have come alive, even without knowing greater, in fact, we didn't know anything about the Bible. We just knew that we were a sinner, we needed help, and confess the blood of the Son, and he changed our life drastically. Has he changed your life? Well, as it relates to a big picture, there's a new sheriff in town, and that happened when he came and he was facing his own creation, and they denied him. He came to his own rejected him. Well, there was a big covenant shift that happened that's misunderstood so greatly, especially in this awakening that many of us are coming, and we're rewinding time to play out the proper events. And that he earned that right by the resurrection of the dead. Now, by the price he paid and the blood he shed for you and me, it was he paying for the covenant that he's the one that ushered. And in Acts 13, it said, for David, after he had served his own generation by the will of Elohim, plural name for God, or singular name for God, mighty one, fell asleep, was buried with his fathers, and saw corruption. But he whom Elohim raised up saw no corruption. Therefore, let it be known to you, brethren, that through this man is preached to you the forgiveness of sins, and by him everyone who believes is justified from all things from which you could not be justified by the law of Moses. We clearly see a distinction between by him and the law of Moses. We are going to touch greatly on this detail, the law of Moses, tremendously misunderstood by both groups of people, Christian and Torah alike. What is the law of Moses? We need to understand this. So here's the summary of what we just read. Notice, David fell asleep after serving his own generation. Each person that's ever lived has been judged according to the covenant. A covenant's a contract in place that the Father created where there was an offer to the people and an acceptance. That's a covenant. It's a contract. And he holds people accountable to the generation they lived. David, though, saw corruption, talking about his body. No, he has not raised from the dead yet. YAHUHA, though, the only one ever who has ascended into heaven, John 3:13, he did see no corruption because his Father raised him from the dead. So now through this man is preached the forgiveness of sins. And by him, again, you are justified. Justified, we're going to cover this, is the word righteous. They're interchangeable. You're made righteous by him and not through the law of Moses. Do you see why it's so important to understand what the law of Moses is? Now, the Hebrew people, they put Torah there and put Torah of Moses. We covered this in detail in part 1 and 2. Please watch those. Here's a picture of the events again. The covenant timeline. Covenant 6, 40 years after the wilderness. This new high priest is of the order of Melchizedek. You can see it clearly on a timeline mapped out. We're going to look at this. So there's a new covenant. Hopefully we'd all agree with a new mediator of that covenant, a new high priest with access to the Father. There was no access before. It was shut down by the veil and by the tabernacle. And there's now forgiveness of sins by a sin offering that through the body of the Messiah. And most importantly, there's now eternal life that only offered through his blood. But guys, that's without obedience. Now, once you come into covenant, you owe him your life. Now you're bound by a blood covenant that will judge you. This is so important to understand how this works, but it's only by his blood you come into covenant. And in Hebrews chapter 9, verse 14, it says, how much more shall the blood of Messiah, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to his Father, Elohim, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living Elohim? It's only through his blood. The next verse, and for this reason, for the reason of his blood, that is, he is in the covenant. He is the mediator of the new covenant by means of death for the redemption of the transgressions under the first covenant. He's paying for the first covenant sins when he came. That those who are called might, that's a condition, may, receive the promise of the eternal inheritance. There's an inheritance at stake for us. A couple chapters later, this is our theme verse. Now may the Elohim of peace, who brought up our master YAHUHA from the dead, that great shepherd of the sheep, through the blood of the eternal covenant. You might miss that if you don't read that closer. It's only through this blood and through this covenant that the Father raised him from the dead. And in the same way, that same covenant that we brought into, that we walk as he walked, knowing our covenant, we walk as he walked in this covenant so that he will raise us from the dead. Do you have the hope of the resurrection of the dead? I sure hope so, and I hope that that's why you're living. We have faith, trust in the Messiah. We follow him. We follow the Lamb wherever he goes. We can only know him, though, by knowing the covenant. A covenant is a marriage-type relationship. Let's talk about under law. Now, I'm putting under law in this time period so you can visually see it between Covenant 6 and Covenant 8. This is what under law means. Let's look at this phrase. Romans 6:14. For sin shall not have dominion over you, for you are not under law, but under grace. Do you see how it clearly says sin shall not have dominion over you? It goes on in the next verse, say, shall we continue to sin that grace might abound? By all means, no. This is not we're not under any instructions. That's what law means, instructions. This is a covenant phrase. This is covenant language. We are not under law in the first covenant, but now we're under grace by his blood. Let's look at this phrase again in Galatians, the chapter after the one we're looking at. This is very relevant to our teaching. Galatians 4:3-6. Even so we, when we were children, were in bondage under the elements of the world. But when the fullness of time had come, Elohim sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under law, under the law. Notice, under the elements of the world. This is the power of sin and Satan. It's in control of the world. Without the Messiah, there is no hope for you. Anybody in Messiah believes that. That's the elements of the world. Born of a woman. This is from the very beginning promise of the broken covenant with Adam, that he's going to send forth the seed of the woman. And guess what? The writer of Galatians, Paul, knows covenant intimately. This is covenant language. Born of a woman. That's the seed of the woman. Born under the law. This is under the law of Moses. We painted the picture at the bottom. Next verse. To redeem those. Redeem means the Goel kinsman redeemer. We covered this in part 2. It's very important to understand this. There's a redemption that costed his life, his blood. He redeemed those who were under the law, the first covenant, that we might receive the adoptions as sons, and because you are sons, Elohim has sent forth the Spirit of his Son into your hearts, crying out, Abba, Father. Do you have the Spirit of the Son in you? Do you have the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit? You must have it to be born again. This is a covenant issue, redeeming under the law, and he sent the Spirit of his Son into your hearts. So again, this is under the law of Moses, first covenant. Through that, I'm putting black for the first covenant, red for the renewed covenant so you can visually see it. That statement there, again, is to become an heir to the kingdom. I'll look at it again here. We might receive the adoption as sons. So how is that? That's because you become an heir to the kingdom. And the new covenant being born again, born of his Spirit. This again is covenant language. We're going to see this over and over and over, everywhere in the writings, especially in Paul and the writer of Hebrews. So, now we're going to talk about the priesthood change. Again, let's look at this visually so you can see this. We're going to look at Mount Sinai, which was 40 years earlier than Covenant 6. So look at the 40-year penalty, and we're going to look at this. In Hebrews 7:19 and 20, This hope we have is an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, and which enters the presence behind the veil. That's a very important statement, guys. Before this, there was no access before the veil. Where the forerunner has entered for us, even YAHUHA, having become high priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. This is a giant covenant statement. So, was there a priesthood change? We're going to zoom in and look. I'm going to zoom in at Mount Sinai right now, so focus. We're looking into Mount Sinai at the 40-year penalty. Guys, for 3 years, we have combed through in granular detail all the events have transpired from Adam. We've mapped out the covenants. We then combed through all the writings. These writers knew covenant. Moses isn't just writing Torah because it's Torah and it's good to do Torah. He's writing covenants events. He actually wrote 7 of the 9 covenants. We covered this again in part 2, I believe, in detail of why Moses was writing what he was writing. He wasn't writing Torah. He's writing the covenants, covenant events, times, places, and people, and genealogies. They're all connected to the covenants. We're zooming in here. As it relates to this study, we haven't shown you this yet. Covenant 1 we label was with Noah. Covenant 2 and 3 were the promises bound by blood covenant to Abraham. Covenant 2 was the unconditional guarantee of land. Covenant 3 was the unconditional guarantee of seed. We will cover this in future studies. We do not have time to cover this, but all these events led up to Covenant 4. Covenant 1 plus 2 plus 3 all equals Covenant 4 because it all took the amount of 430 years to play out, where all the events were one singular covenant. That's why this is such a mystery. Now, for the first time in history, the Father at Mount Sinai for 2,500 years after Adam, for the first time entered covenant with more than one person. It was only one man, Noah, one man, Abraham. Then he passed it to one man, Isaac, one man, Jacob. It was split into 12 boys. Well, those 12 boys multiplied approximately, we know from Scripture, 600,000 males, approximately 1.5 million. Doesn't matter, it's a lot of people. All of Abraham's descendants plus sojourners, aliens, and foreigners all came to Mount Sinai, and what we label as covenant number 4 is called the Book of the Covenant. Notice, Book of the Covenant. And we don't have time to cover that. We covered some of it before. We'll cover more later. This is the offer of the covenant in Exodus. Every covenant has an offer, and there's terms and conditions as well. Here's the offer of this covenant. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom, a priest, and a holy nation. Focus on that, kingdom, a priest. Do you realize this is exactly repeated in 1 Peter chapter 2 about us being a kings and priests, a royal priesthood, and a holy nation and treasure possession? He's repeating the covenant. Covenant number 4 is what was renewed by the Messiah in his blood. Covenant 2, 3, and 4 we have in red because they're blood covenants. There's a giant difference between a blood-ratified covenant and one that was not blood-ratified. This was the Melchizedek priesthood up until Covenant 4, and it was an offer to make them all kings and priests according to the order of Melchizedek. There was a big problem that happened, though. The golden calf. It broke the entire plan. Moses shattered in righteous anger, shattered the wedding ketubah. Ketubah in Hebrew is a wedding contract. The first set of stone tablets with the giving of the 10 commandments is the covenant. The first set of stone tablets is this covenant. He shattered it because of what they did. They profaned the covenant. The Father was going to wipe them out from underneath heaven. If anybody reads these stories, I don't see how they see a glorious story on man's part. It was broken many times over and over again. He was about ready to blot them out. Moses intercedes. He gives instructions to the Levites. They must kill people. Get this. They have to kill people to atone for the blood of the covenant. This is how serious a blood covenant is, guys. We're in a blood covenant with our Messiah. So in Exodus 32:29, the Levites did as Moses commanded, and that day about 3,000 of them died. Then Moses said, remember, Moses is saying this as a good thing that they killed these people. You have been set apart to YAHUHA today, for you were against your own sons and brothers, and he has blessed you to this day. We don't have time to comb through this. There was an exchange that happened. Remember the offer of the covenant. They were all going to be kings and priests. Levi was now given the priesthood only because they stepped forward. They were all given the offer to step forward and atone for the covenant. Only the Levites did because Moses was a fellow Levite. They stepped forward. They were given the priesthood, and that everything changed. The Levites were given the priesthood. This, guys, is the most important thing you'll ever see in rightly dividing the scriptures. Covenant number 5 is the second set of stone tablets. It was given in the second trip Moses went up the mountain for 40 days. We are going to cover this in great, great detail in future studies. This, guys, is what Scripture is referring to every single time you read the law of Moses. Now, sometimes it could include the book of the law because the book of the law was added to Covenant 5 later. We'll show you that. I'm going to go back to this picture. I'm zooming out again. Right here at Mount Sinai, the Levites were given the priesthood. There was a covenant change, drastic, that happened. Covenant 5 again, the law of Moses. And here's the interpretation. Hebrews 7:11. Therefore, if perfection, that word perfection is completion, were through the Levitical priesthood, for under it, under what? The Levitical priesthood, the people received what? The law of Moses, the second set. The first set was shattered, and it was a done deal. He ushered in an alternative plan B. Plan B was only put into place as a temporary plan to get to the Messiah. So for under this, the law of Moses, the people received the law with the Levitical priesthood. What further need was there that another priest should rise according to the order of Melchizedek and not called according to the order of Aaron? The next verse says it all. Verse 12. For the priesthood being changed, of necessity, there's also a change of the law. Of the law. The law changed because there's a new sheriff in town. That's how I began this. And his name is YAHUHA HaMashiach, the Messiah, who changed the law because he freed us from being under the law. This again is covenant language. This law was fulfilled. It was ended. That should be actually ended, not fulfilled. It was an end of that. So I zoom in on this again. These two people, can you see the dynamic? The runner in red behind under grace and the runner in yellow highlighted. There's a change that happened, guys. And this is the gravity of the events of the entire New Testament, including the Messiah, who is facing teachers of the law, not the Torah, as in first 5 books, the law of Moses. He's facing his own people that was supposed to point to him, because over and over again, Moses said there'd be a prophet to come after him. Now, we're going to have we're going to call our teaching series the Two Covenant series. The New Covenant versus the Law of Moses. We are going to walk in detail through 100 or more teachings from the very beginning, Adam, and walk you through connecting all the dots of how this all works. Let's go back to this question, part 1. Understanding this covenant change which took place on the stake 2,000 years ago is to really understand your calling. And we're pleading with you guys as your fellow servants that we want you to join us in our calling to usher in the bridegroom of his second return. It's the highest calling in the universe, and we must understand our covenant. Your identity, I put your house, okay? That's not familiar. You probably have a religious term associated with it. We're now going to establish your identity, who you really are, because remember, We're living 2,000 years after him, and there's terms like Christian and Baptist and Presbyterian, and I go to a synagogue down the road, and I'm a member of this club or this group or that group. Guys, in a next study, in part 4, we're going to address where these, what has happened to the quote-unquote church fathers, and without even a printing press being invented till the 14th century, the amount of error that we have crept in. We are going to literally interpret this from 2,000 years ago using covenant as an understanding. So we can know the covenant that was written on our heart and on our mind. Covenant 6 and 8. We got to draw this again on a big picture between 6 and 8. I'm summarizing part 1, where I spent at the 1 hour and 17 minute mark about 30 minutes covering and answering question 1. This is a summary. The book of Deuteronomy is the book of the law. It was a covenant that contained curses for disobedience. It was written in the 40th year following the 40-year penalty. It allowed the second generation out of Egypt to become YAHUHA's people. And the main point of the whole covenant is they had to wait 40 years simply so the father had enough with the first generation. Anybody 20 years old or over that was standing at Mount Sinai when they heard the giving of the 10 Commandments, and then they disobeyed a second time. He gave them a second chance with the sin of the 10 spies, gave them a 40-year punishment specifically so they would die off. So there's a new agreement with the book of the law that put them under law, the second generation. It went into effect when Joshua led them into the land. It brought the people back into a covenant relationship. They were cut off for 40 years. And this is the most surprising event at all. If you're watching us for the first time, guys, the tabernacle's function was only for 40 years. That's it. The sacrificial system, personal sacrifices, we're not talking about the annual feasts. Personal sacrifices relates to the sin offering and the guilt offering, was only in play for 40 years, guys. 40 years. It was placed beside the Ark of the Covenant. You see, the position of the book of the law was next to the Ark of the Covenant as it was a witness against the people. No longer to bring a sin offering. We're just going to bring disaster on you as a witness against you, because the book of the law now is requiring you to do everything written in the book of the law. You know, the book of Deuteronomy, where many people are trying to convince themselves they have to do those things in there. Now, I need to stop you real quick. The book of Deuteronomy is extremely useful. It's extreme blessing. It's got many events. The point is, the book of Deuteronomy wouldn't have been written had it not been for the sin of the 10 spies. The law of Moses, Covenant 5, wouldn't have been given if they wouldn't have done the golden calf. So there's many things we can take out of the book of Deuteronomy. I'm just talking about the instructions therein that were not given, that were given after the golden calf. So it was also found in King Josiah's day where wrath was poured out. And this wrath is what we're going to look at. We're establishing your identity. I'm going back to telling the story of where we came from. How did this all happen? Was Jesus a Christian? No, we know that. He was a Jew, right? Well, as it relates to Jew, we don't have the right understanding of what even a Jew is. The letter J was invented again 400 years ago. It would have been converting it to letter J have been a Judean. But the main thing to know is the story needs to be played forward, not backwards. And when we see that, we can see clarity. Now, this covenant specifically, this is the main thing to understand as it relates to this teaching and this identity pointing out right now. There were curses associated with this, and the ultimate curse was that he would scatter them out of their inheritance. The land was their inheritance. He was going to scatter them because of disobedience if they were to break the book of the law, which they did grossly as a collective unit. And every prophet wrote about this, every single one of them, about the scattering of his people. All the prophets, by the way, were half the Old Testament's written in that short 200-year period where we show that arrow where Israel was divorced, completely divorced. That's a covenant term, being divorced, being cast out from his presence and away, which was his land, which is where he was causing his name to dwell. And in those period of time right there, you can see it. All the prophets are writing in that short period of time right there. Again, a timeline aspect is crucial to understanding Scripture, and then to understand the background of the covenant that they were under, which was the inspiration of the writers and the prophets, and the same inspiration by which I'm giving you this teaching right now, because it's the same Spirit that dwelled with them that's dwelling within me. As we map this out, we need to really quickly, as quick as I can, cover the covenantal issues leading up to this new covenant, and as it relates to the scattering of his people. Remember, this was effective in the land, this covenant. They had another big problem. They rejected him as the king. He was their king. And right here is where they rejected him. Right before King David. Saul was made the king by the people, not by the father, by the people. He reigned for 40 years. Saul was, though, also offered this everlasting kingdom, but he disobeyed. YAHUHA, though, chose David as king to rule over all 12 tribes of Israel. Now, we don't have time in a future identity teaching. We're going to walk through how this all works to the 12 tribes, but just know this, at this point right now where that arrow is, shortly after that is where David gets the covenant, and he's chosen to rule over all 12 tribes. Now, David's heart wanted to build a house for the Father. But YAHUHA said, I'm going to build you a house. Remember I said your identity is what house are you? YAHUHA made a covenant with David to build him a house, as long as he kept the covenant, and that covenant was the book of the law, with all of his heart, because he's under this book of the law as king. And here's where he's at on the covenant timeline. The Father makes a covenant. Now, guys, this did not change covenant 6 or 5. Covenant 5 being the law of Moses, covenant 6 being the book of the law. They were added together. It doesn't change the promises made to Abraham, covenants 2 and 3. And it certainly doesn't change the covenant number 1 with Noah, because that covenant was with the entire earth and all of creation. He systematically, slowly was building his covenant plan up to the culmination where he entered with all of Abraham's descendants, and then the problem was he found fault with the people. Now here we are in David's day, and this is a very critical fact to understand. I'm going to mention this a couple times in future slides here. This is crucial. The Father entered a covenant with David as king to rule over all 12 tribes of Israel forever. Forever. David, of course, is from Judah, and YAHUHA is also from Judah. A very important covenant fact there to mention. David's son, though, which was supposed to be the seed to take over the kingdom, he breaks the covenant in every which way you could possibly break it. And he was David's son. The seed was supposed to pass through David's loin, which the Father still made work. Now, the book of the law is the only time in the covenant time period that there's actually a provision that if they do select a king, this is in Deuteronomy chapter 17, if they do select a king, these are the events. When you come into the land, this is the book of the law we're reading, and remember, they hadn't selected a king. This is a story. The king hadn't been selected until they reject him as king. So you can see the Father's heart. He didn't ever want them to have a king, but he put it in the covenant of what they're supposed to do in the case they do elect a king. Now, when you come into the land, which is the land promised by covenant to Abraham, the land, which YAHUHA your Elohim is giving you, and possess it and dwell in it, and say, I will set a king over me like all the other nations that are around me. That's the problem. He didn't want them to be like all the other nations. He's just like us today. He doesn't want us to be like all the other nations. You shall surely set a king over you, whom YAHUHA your Elohim chooses, one from among your brethren, you shall set as a king over you. You, now pay attention, I've listed these in yellow. There's going to be 6 of them specifically. You, number 1, may not set a foreigner over you, who is not your brother. Number 2, he shall not multiply horses for himself. nor cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. For YAHUHA said to you, you shall not return that way again. Neither, number 3, shall he multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor, number 4, shall he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself. Now, we're reading a contract. This is like legal terms. If we're in a court battle and there's an issue over a contract, you simply pull out the contract. That's what this is. We're reading a contract. This continues. It shall be, when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, that he shall write for himself, notice, a copy of this law in a book. What law in a book? The book of the law that's in the book. From the one before the priests, the Levites. And it shall be with him, and he shall read it all the days of his life, that he may learn to, here's number 5, fear YAHUHA your Elohim. And be, here's number 6, careful to observe all the words, all of them, every one of them. Do you remember that's the first question of the Galatians series? In number 1, cursed are those that do not do all the words that are written in this book of the law. Now, again, go back to part 1. We cover that in detail. That phrase is mentioned many times in the book of the law. And these statutes, that his heart may not be lifted up above his brethren, that he may not turn aside from the commandment to the right hand or to the left, and that he may prolong his days in the kingdom, he and his children in the midst of Israel. Now Solomon breaks the covenant. We're going to summarize what we just read. He breaks the covenant. We're not going to summarize what we read. We're going to summarize the commands we shouldn't have been broken that Solomon did. Here's the summary. Solomon, he ended up multiplying horses, wives, gold, and silver in direct violation of this covenant, the book of the law. Solomon also did the worst of all. He turned around and worshipped other gods, Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Shemosh, the god of the Moabites, and Melkomi, the god of the people of Ammon. And then YAHUHA tore the kingdom from Solomon and gave 10 tribes to Jeroboam. Jeroboam, by the way, was also offered the kingdom, and he was even worse than Solomon. So 10 tribes were torn to Jeroboam. YAHUHA was left 1 tribe, he specifically said, to Judah, and he did this for David's sake, according to his covenant with him, for David's sake. So if you can pay attention here to the orange pointed out, that is where Solomon broke the covenant. Now, right now, we're going to zoom into this period of time. We're zooming in between covenant 7 and 8 after the breaking of this. Right here. Getting closer between 7 and 8. I want to remind you of this crucial covenant fact. YAHUHA enters covenant which he will not break. That's what a covenant is. The Father's faithful. It's just the problem is men aren't. But he's calling us to be obedient, because if our repercussion, just like the ones that have gone before us, we simply don't inherit the kingdom, which is where he's at, which is where the land which was promised to our father Abraham. But the fact again, YAHUHA enters covenant with David as king to rule over all 12 tribes of Israel forever. So the kingdom here, right here, was split into 2 houses, house of Israel and the house of Judah. 10 tribes to Israel, 2 to Judah, 1 for David's sake, and Benjamin was with Judah. The house of Israel is divorced. In Jeremiah 3:8, then I saw that for all the causes for which backsliding Israel had committed adultery, I had put her away and given her a certificate of divorce. Now, you might just have read this before and breezed right through it. This is such a crucial covenant issue here. There's a certificate of divorce that the Father has issued. This, by the way, shouldn't surprise you. It's quoting the book of the law, that there be a certificate of divorce and the terms that govern the certificate of divorce. He's a legal and lawful father. He follows his own covenant. Sounds fair, right? And when we stand before him, we won't have any excuse because it's going to be the covenant that judges us. He's already told us what it is. We've just been lied to by so many teachers of this free grace issue. Grace is actually making us more accountable, but it has freed us in a mighty way if we understand the gravity of what had happened here. The certificate of divorce. Now, when you see a marriage, think a covenant. When you see certificate of divorce, think of a marriage. We have a husband and a wife, a bridegroom and a bride. The father was the bridegroom to the people, but he actually divorced them. And he offered them or issued them a certificate of divorce. That's not a good thing. And it's the 10 northern tribes went away forever. We're establishing your identity and how the new covenant even came into fruition. And here's the book of the law. We're looking again at the divorce in 722 BC that happened with the 10 northern tribes. According to the curses of the covenant, every single prophet mentions this about the scattering of his people, but then the promise that's within the book of the law, it's within the pages of the contract, he won't be mad with them forever. He will regather them. And in Deuteronomy 30, verse 6, in that regathering, that glimpse of hope after he says he's going to scatter them for disobedience, for the curses of the book of the law, he's going to circumcise their heart. Did that happen to you? Did he circumcise your heart? Did he give you the Spirit? Yes, he did. He circumcised your heart if you become born again. Now, we've been lied to, and our church fathers, many of them not knowingly, just repeated different error that has creeped along the way. Our identity is everything, though, who we are and why we do what we do. So in Romans, now Paul wrote this not in our day, in his day. Now look at his language, what he says. Paul says in Romans 7, 1 through 2, or do you not know, brethren? Now he's making it clear who he's talking to. For I speak to those who know the law. What law? The law of Moses, the covenant they were under. Remember, Paul's writing it in his day. He was even executing the curses of the book of the law on the people. He was stoning them, and he was at Stephen's side, not understanding their own Messiah till he knocked them off his horse. Then he got this special revelation. That's why he's writing this. This is such a special understanding that only Paul seemed to have. I speak to those who know the law, that the law of Moses, has dominion over a man as long as he lives. For the woman who has, now he's repeating the book of the law, in Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4. For the woman who has a husband is bound by the law, the book of the law, to her husband as long as she lives. But if the husband dies, she is released from the law of her husband. Isn't this incredible? There's a provision there that you're bound forever unless he dies. Well, the bridegroom did die. And it's Romans 7:4. Therefore, my brethren, you also have become dead to the law, the book of the law of Moses. There's a new sheriff in town again. Through the body of Messiah. His body was the sin offering that the book of the law was sitting next to the Ark of the Covenant, playing the role of the temporary sacrifices that was executed for 40 years in the wilderness. But then eventually their sins reached heaven, and he compiled all their sins on the people by scattering them. And his body has freed them from the book of the law, that you may be married to another, to him who was raised from the dead. Guys, a new sheriff in town rose from the dead. Nobody's ever done that before. We need to follow him, that we should bear fruit to Elohim. Now that should make perfect sense of this verse then. In Matthew 15:24, the Messiah says, I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Notice he's not sent to the Christians. He didn't set up a new religion. Does that make sense? See, Constantine came 300 years later. We're going to deal with that in part 4 of this study. The next part, we're going to deal with the mindset and what crept in and what eventually Constantine did. But remember, on a timeline, we're graphing this out. The story got changed after him by people that did not understand what really took place. So he came only for the lost sheep of Israel. The lost sheep. Now here's Israel, the house of Israel, right? The Messiah is talking, and what is he pointing to? The scattering of the houses by the book of the law that it scattered them into the nations. That's why he came. Now here's why, for the reason. Now, before I do that, that's where the word nations come from. Now, guys, Gentiles, not one time is it in the original text. It's just a word that we've inherited with the wrong understanding of what it is. Every single time you see the word Gentiles, it means nations. You're not a Gentile, you're of the nations. Why? You've been scattered into the nations. Now, it doesn't matter how or where or why. How would anybody be able to trace their heritage back 2,000 years? But somehow the Father knew, spiritually speaking, when you would come to him, and he brought you back in to where he first scattered them, not 2,000 years ago, almost 2,800 years ago. Scattered them. They completely lost their identity. Have you lost your identity? Are you finding it now? I'm praying right now that the Father would speak to you who you really are in Messiah and your identity. By blood covenant in the Messiah, you're coming back as a lost sheep of the house of Israel. You even did when you didn't know it. Now, does that make perfect sense of Psalm 2, speaking prophetically of the Messiah? I will declare the decree, YAHUHA to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will give you the nations for your inheritance. How is that even possible, guys? David wrote this when the covenant was given to him. The kingdom hadn't even been split yet. And that's how he's going to do it, because David knew the covenant. We're going to talk about that in a second. He knew the covenant. The promise to Abraham was going to happen. Even though David wasn't alive when they would eventually, his son would disobey. You think he'd have a sit-down talk with his son Solomon, right? If he knew what he was going to do by building the temple, multiplying gold and silver, horses and wives, according to the book of the law. That speaks of discipleship, huh? We need to really be watching our kids and really be showing them the ways of the kingdom, because somehow it went really awry for David's household. But David did know this was going to happen, that the nations would become in for the inheritance, and he was going to begot the son that would do it. He wasn't making that up. It's written in the covenants. Covenants are a contract. I want to remind you of this critical fact. YAHUHA entered covenant with David as king to rule over all 12 tribes of Israel forever, even our day. As the prophet Amos is talking here, on that day, I will raise up the tabernacle. That word tabernacle is equal to house or tent of David, which has fallen down. The prophet knows the covenant. He knows what's going to happen, prophetically speaking. And in the next verse, and all the Gentiles. I use Gentiles because we're all used to that word. That word is nations in the original text. Go get the Young's literal translation. It says nations. And all the nations who are called by my name. Gentiles. The word is Strong's 1471 Goy. Gentiles equals nations. Now let's interpret this through Acts 15. This is the event surrounding what do we do with these new Gentiles, those people from the nations. Simon has declared how Elohim at the first visited the nations, the Gentiles. This is Peter that the writer of Acts is talking about. To take out of them a people for his name, out of the nations. And with this, the words of the prophets agree, just as it is written, after this I will return and will rebuild. He's quoting Amos, the tabernacle of David, which has fallen down. Guys, this is after the Messiah has died. This is after Shavuot, Pentecost. The Spirit has fallen. The new covenant is in full force. Can you connect the dots? We are them. They are us. If you lived in the book of Acts time, that would be you. You wouldn't be going to the big Christian church down the road, and all the different denominations being called a Christian. That word came later. You would be part of the nations, completely clueless of the covenant, but you'd be coming in. We unfortunately can read the scriptures and twist it. They didn't know what was going on. So here we are, big picture again. Here's the summary of the events leading up to the new covenant. The house of Israel is divorced and scattered by curses in the book of the law. The house of Israel became the nations by losing their identity. Nations equal Gentiles. The Messiah came only for those people that were scattered, the lost sheep of Israel. YAHUHA sent the Messiah to rebuild the tabernacle of David, the house of David, because he's good to his covenant. Remember, David's going to rule forever over all 12 tribes. We have a big covenant problem here. This is why Paul is writing this mysterious language that is so beautiful and magnificently written, completely butchered from all sides, Christian, Torah alike, because they can't put the word Torah in there and make it fit. So they got to make it up. And now here's another dot. You are then a lost sheep of Israel in Messiah. The book of the law is what brought curses for disobedience by answering question 1 in this series, relying on the works of law. Does that make sense? If you're going to give up the Messiah and his spirit and say, no, I'm going to do all of these laws written in this book. I don't need the Messiah nor his blood, even though his Messiah freed you from that, and they're only put on them as a burden for a purpose to keep them until the Messiah would come, and eventually scattered them. And now we're going to convince people they better do all these laws here in Deuteronomy. I better worry about what to do on the year where I got to give my land a rest. You guys wearing tzitzit out there? There's some big problems here in interpretation. So now, only by faith, by trust, by belief in the one who rose from the dead, you know his name, YAHUHA, you can call him Jesus. You know 2,000 years ago that he died for you. That's about all I knew. And now looking back at the truth that I had, that's about all I had. That's all you need to begin. Trust in him, guys. Put your faith in his blood. His blood will cleanse you. His blood will empower you. His blood will be able to break chains around you. Not a bunch of laws. That's not the way covenant's designed. Laws will confine you. Laws will trap you. Now, the word law is instructions. You must follow his instructions, but you don't lead by them, okay? You need to know your bridegroom first. You put your faith in him, your trust. Then you become obedient. Why? Because he's your stronger blood covenant partner, and he'll sanctify you. So only by faith in YAHUHA can you come into right standing by his blood covenant. As the first covenant, there it is, Matthew 5:17, Luke 24:44, Romans 10:4. I'm sorry to tell you this. It's ended. It's done. It's fulfilled. The power of the grave has been beaten. This is something to rejoice over, not to try to cram into our theological pipe and smoke it. Because we want to make our teaching stick. We only want the truth. So we are now more accountable. This is where the culmination of this message is. It doesn't make you less accountable. It makes you more accountable to our instructions of the covenant, because now he's filled us with his spirit, wrote his laws in our mind and our heart. In part 2 of this study, we're going to discuss in the second half. We covered this in great detail in part 1. I'm encouraging you to go to and watch that, the book of the law. Now, Abraham versus the law. This will make sense to you, hopefully, after seeing this. Galatians 3:5. By faith in the seed of Abraham versus the law of Moses. Therefore, he who supplies the Spirit to you and works miracles among you, does he do it by the works of the law? Do you see what the writer's saying? Paul is saying by the works of the law. They're under the book of the law. People are gravitating. They were born again in Messiah. Their lives were changed, and they're getting pressured by the Judeans. Do you guys feel pressure sometimes? Hey, you got to do this law. You got to do that law. No, you better do this law. Do you see they're doing exactly what Paul warned against? Do not do this to them. Don't do it. You're free. So now, all of a sudden, the people didn't understand in his day what had happened. Well, Paul understood what happened, and the Messiah freed him by the book, from the book of law, because it's the hearing of faith. This law, again, is the law of Moses. This faith is faith in the Son, in his blood. This begins your walk with the Messiah. You're now empowered. You're changed forever. His blood has atoned you. You now have power, to freedom to walk in the ways of him and not by Satan. You've been just broken free from the power of Satan. By the way, that's an important issue. Satan had control all the way up to the Messiah. So these laws and this glorious story we've read isn't glorious, and those laws weren't there, especially after the golden calf. They only held them there till the Messiah. They were the schoolmaster, Galatians 3:24, because the devil had the power over people and over this world. He still has that power, but only those that walk by faith in the Son, he has no power over. There's a big covenant change. There's a new sheriff in town. Now, forwarding a couple verses later, Galatians 3:8, by faith in the seed, and the scripture foreseeing Elohim would justify, there's the word, the nations by faith, preach the gospel, that's good news, that's associated with the blood covenant, to Abraham beforehand, saying, in you all the nations shall be blessed. Now, where do we read that? That's by the blood covenant made, blood binding covenant with Abraham, the promise that in him all the nations. Now, we covered this in one of the early studies, and we showed you the answer to the question. I asked this question on this issue. We answered in detail. Please go watch that video. So now we're back to this two covenant mystery. Now that we've covered a lot of territory on law, this is such a mystery. Paul's writings. Did he support the law? Did he oppose the law? Or was he speaking covenant language? Again, in question 1, this is the whole root of the whole issue, why I started asking these questions. Question number 1 was, all who rely on observing the law are under curse. Question 7, which we're going to answer next, that's the next question to be answered, is the inheritance. That's the most important question to understand. Inheriting the kingdom. And why the inheritance doesn't depend on the law. Question 8. Question 10, why the law was added for transgression. Why the law was added until the seed came. Why the law was given through angels. And why the law was entrusted to a mediator. By the way, 13's in error, and I'll answer that later. That should be an angel. Sorry to give that question away. You might be wondering what that means. Anyway, Galatians 3:24 is the schoolmaster. You can visually see it, the schoolmaster, from the book, from Covenant 6 to Covenant 8. Now, I'm going to play this slide we played for you in the first study and the second study. I built up the momentum up until this study. Now that I've shown you the covenant connections and how the dots all connect, now we're going to read again what the two basic interpretations of law are. One is from mainstream Christianity. When they see the word law or they read these verses that we're covering in Galatians, they say, you know what? Jesus died to give us grace. We are now not under law, but under grace. We know that that's true. We just know that their interpretation is not right. The new covenant is the New Testament and only authority. The old covenant is the Old Testament and its laws are obsolete. Now, Gentile Christians like me are not like the Old Testament Jews and all of those laws. Jesus gave us two commands, love God and love your neighbor. That's the law. Nobody can keep the commandments because we're just all sinners. And the law of the Spirit has freed us. Now, on the other side, an equal opposite error for exactly the opposite reasons is on this side, the Hebrew roots, the Messianic, the Torah keeper, because they haven't been revealed, the deep mystery that we're teaching you right now. Law means Torah, which is the first 5 books of Moses. So whenever they see law of Moses, they don't see it as a covenant, first covenant, temporarily added as plan B, ended at Messiah. They, second set of stone tablets specifically, book of Leviticus, and then added the book of Deuteronomy, okay? They don't see it that way. They see it as, no, you don't understand. It's all 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Numbers. Even though it was written at different periods of time, it covered a span of 2,500 years. It's mentioning 7 different covenants. I cover this in part 2 in detail. Then they say, if Yeshua kept the first 5 books of Moses, certainly we must do it too. Then they say, look, when law is mentioned in a negative way, it is referring to the oral laws. Makes sense, right? But see, the problem is the oral laws were written in books 300 years later, and because of our poor way of putting this on a timeline, plus minus this revelation, we have to make something up because we have to stick. It has to stick. The first 5 books of Moses is what's so important. Therefore, if it's negative, it's got to be the oral law. Therefore, if I'm, it's got to be what it means. And then therefore, in Romans 10:4, the interpretation of that YAHUHA is the end of the law, they have to put Torah there. And they go, no, end doesn't mean end. It has to mean goal. He's the goal of the law. And they say, well, Yeshua, he filled up the law. That's what Matthew 5:17 means. Doesn't mean he ended or fulfilled the law and the prophets. He's just filling it up. He filled it up. That's what the word means. Then they say, well, look, here's the best way to do it. Some of them. Yeah, here, you guys, you understand. You just keep them all you can. That never made sense to me, guys. Did that ever make sense to you? Hey, just do what you can. Wait a second. Can you just tell me what's required of me? Is there a way to find this out? Is there a rightly dividing point that 2 Timothy 2:15 says? That we need to be a good steward, rightly dividing the word of truth? There's got to be an answer here, right? Guys, I've been seeking with all my heart to find this. And I feel like we fell into an ocean full of treasure because we know what righteousness is. We know what keeping our covenant is. We know what inheriting the kingdom means. We know what salvation means. We know what weeping and gnashing of teeth means. We know who the foolish virgins mean. This, by the way, guys, if you stick with us in this teaching, it will decode every scripture you've ever wanted to know. It's simply connected to the covenants. And if you know your contracts and you know how they all connect, you can fill the dots. So as it relates to the 613, the answer is you keep them all you can. But I'm not a priest. I'm not a woman. I'm not a rabbi. I don't live in Israel. There's no temple. There's no sacrifices. So that one doesn't apply. That one doesn't apply. That one doesn't apply. The phylacteries, they just don't look very cool. The tzitzit, that's kind of neat. I'll wear those. And that is not the right way. Hopefully we're showing you that really what is going on here, a misunderstanding on both sides, is it's covenant language. It's the law of Moses versus the new covenant. This again is law of Moses being fulfilled. This is covenant language being spoken. Masterful, I might add. Now let me give you a dictionary definition here. If you want to write this down real quick, because you can go to your scriptures yourself, and I assure you that this will be the way you can look at the verses. And it doesn't matter where. We could have spent hours upon hours showing you the verses of what the writers are meaning, especially Paul, especially the book of Hebrews, and especially the background of what the Messiah was doing. So every time you see the phrase, the book of the law, it's many times in Scripture, only once in the New Testament, in Galatians 3:10, many times in Nehemiah, in Joshua, certainly in the book of the law, it's mentioned 3 or 4 times there where it's first mentioned. The phrase book of the law always means the book of Deuteronomy. Always. It's always a standalone covenant. The phrase the law of Moses, every single time you see the phrase law of Moses, it always means the first covenant. The phrase law and the prophets, every time you see that, it always means the first covenant. The phrase the law, every time you see the phrase the law in the New Testament, I would say, well, the writer of Hebrews and in Paul, in the New Testament, when it is used in a negative sense or referring anywhere to the Old Testament, is always speaking of the first covenant. The phrase the law in the New Testament, when used in a positive way or enforcing his laws of the kingdom, is always referring to the new covenant. And both of these, used in a negative way and a positive way, is why it's so hard to decipher how this fully works and the deep mystery comes together. It's the 10 Commandments, guys. The second set of stone tablets was the law of Moses. It was not blood ratified. In addition to it was statutes and laws. Some of them are still valid in our covenant. Some of them were absolutely for the first covenant. And by the way, if you've ever wondered, the sacrificial system came into play at one time in history after the Levites atoned for the blood covenant they broke. Levites were given the priesthood, and into the contract came the book of Leviticus, and the first 7 chapters are geared on sacrifices because they broke a blood covenant. Now they had to temporarily do the sacrifices. However, the original plan was the book of the covenant, which we showed you, covenant 4. So, the big picture. What law is Paul really writing about, right? The word law, again, just means, Strong's 8451, Torah, it just means teaching or instructions. But the question is it first covenant or second covenant? Now, we're going to talk about something very briefly. So brief, I only have this one slide dedicated to it, is our English words. If you're a Christian, you never really dug deeper into the words in our English language, we've inherited an abstract language. In other words, it means different things to different people. It isn't connected with an absolute idea. And the definition of abstract means existing in thought or as an idea, but not having a physical or concrete existence. Would you say that's a problem? In other words, if you're reading a word in the scriptures, and I'm going to show you several of them here, and you can't really have a concrete idea of it, don't you think you need to at least search out that there might be a deeper meaning? Remember, the scriptures were not written in English. Concrete, existing in a material or physical form, real or solid, not abstract. The Hebrew language is concrete. The ancient pictograph is concrete. The concepts are concrete. Remember, on the timeline, English came around, somebody might have to help me out with this, 12th century, 13th century. Letter J was added to our alphabet. The letter V, W, certain things, our alphabet expanded. By the word, Aleph and Beit are the first 2 letters of the Hebrew language, and we have our alpha and our alphabet. It came from the Aleph Beit, the Hebrew. It evolved, it changed, and so did the writers that were writing it with abstract understanding. That's why so many theologians write so many books, because they're all thought-based, doctrine-based. Concrete is action-based, is how you live your life, not what you think. That's the abstract, what you think. Now, these words include these words in the English, among many other: love, faith, grace, holy, praise, worship, righteous. There's many more. These are all abstract words that need better understanding, and you have to dig deeper. I'm sorry, guys, to say you have to dig deeper. You can't just rely on an English interpretation. You can say the Spirit showed you. That's good. Spirit will show you, but guess what the Spirit's job is to do? Lead and guide you into all truth. So if I'm telling you there is a deeper meaning and there's truth to that, it's your job to go find out. So we're going to look at this word righteous, just this one. Strong's 1347, it's the act of pronouncing righteous or acquittal. Now that's the Greek understanding of it. Now, who's pronouncing it? What's the standard? There's many, it doesn't really give the concrete. Now the Hebrew is Strong's 6663. Zadik or Zadik. Acquit, declare to be righteous or to be vindicated. Now I don't mean, I got to be clarified. I mean in the Hebrew Old Testament or the Greek New Testament. That's the same Strong's word. The problem is both of these are abstract definitions. Now, I thought about putting the whole explanation that Jeff Benner put on this one word. And I encourage you to go to the website. I'm going to advertise in a second. But I just summarized because we don't have the time to look at it all. I want to just give you the main definition. It's very simple. It's one who remains on the path. That's his conclusion. And it's the antonym, the opposite is Rasha is the word wicked. I always thought wicked was, a murderer or somebody that did some evil thing, killed some people, raped some people. It's simply one who departs from the path. That's all it means. Wicked is one who departs from the path. Righteous is one who remains on the path. And guys, the path is the covenant, is the instructions of the covenant. If you want to go more to his website, it's ancient-hebrew.org. Been a blessing to us is to find some of these words. Let's look at this again. One who remains on the path. Law, again, is the instructions of the covenant, and the covenant is the path. A righteous person is one who remains on the path. One who keeps the covenant is one who is declared righteous. Does it make sense? So righteousness, as all those other words we could spend time on, is connected to the instructions of our covenant. Would you say that this is an important understanding to have, our blood covenant instructions? Now, the same word, these are equal words, whether the English translation says justification or justified, or righteous or righteousness, it's the same word, okay? We're going to read a couple of these verses as it relates to law. Let's first look at Romans 2:13. Again, we're back to the subject of Paul's writings and examining them. Now, Romans 2:13 says, "For not the hearers of the law are just in the sight of Elohim, but the doers," again, action, doers of the law will be declared righteous, justified. Now look at this is not Romans 2:13. Actually, it is Romans 2:13. Here's what I'm showing you. I apologize. I forgot why I put this up there. I'm translating into righteous. It is not those who hear the law who are righteous in Yahuwah's sight, but it is those who obey the law who are to be declared righteous. One of these translations from the NIV, the others from the New King James. So I'm just showing you it's the same thing. Okay. Now I'm going to compare Romans 2:13, same writer, in the same book, guys. So he says the doers. Well, I'm going to get back to the book, but he's the same writer. Galatians 5:4. You have become estranged from the Messiah, you who attempt to be justified by the law. You have fallen from grace. Do you see how the Christian could read that? Oh, no, I don't want to be justified by the law. But Romans 2:13 says the doers of the law be justified. So how can that be? How can on the same writer say, it's the same writer, guys, the doers will be justified, but he also says, if you attempt to be justified by the law, you've fallen from grace. What's going on here? This is the two covenant mystery. Now, let's look at a third verse to make clarity on this. Justified by the law or fallen from grace? What is it? Let's look at Acts 13:39. We read this before, a few slides ago. Through him, everyone is justified from the things from which you could not be justified by the law of Moses. Through him. So through him is YAHUHA the Messiah? You're justified. This is covenant language, blood covenant. And the law of Moses, you could not be justified. Do you see how this is covenant language? Acts 13:39 is the perfect, what would you say, definition or decoding of those prior two verses. So now, I'm putting a warning here. If you're just now seeing this, stop. Before we jump to conclusions of what the law of Moses is, please continue with us. You might be surprised. We covered that, the law of Moses is. I just didn't want you to be alarmed because a lot of people have preconceived ideas that will throw them off. Wait a second. So we're looking at these three verses, all compared together. For not the hearers of the law are just or righteous in the sight of Elohim, but the doers. You got the doers of the law. Notice it says in the sight of Elohim. This clearly would be the sight of Elohim being the new covenant. Now Galatians 5:4, you have been estranged from the Messiah, you who attempt to be justified by the law. The law would be the book of the law. Remember that they're under the law of Moses. And you become estranged from him because you came by faith to him and now you're trying to go back to it. That's the big picture in Galatians. That's why we're going to do part 4 in great detail of the big picture. Now this law is fulfilled by the Messiah. So you can see how he says this. Now, and this is the verse we just looked at. Through him, everyone is justified from all things which you could not be justified by the law of Moses. Through him. And this law is the law of Moses versus the new covenant in the same verse. Through him and the law of Moses. Covenant language. Law of Moses in this one and new covenant in this. Now let's go back to our two perspectives that we looked at a few slides ago. Remember, we went through this entire issue. On the left side, they predominantly say that's all done away with, the law, because Paul says so. And the other guys say, no, you keep all the laws because Paul did. You know, he circumcised Timothy. He took a Nazirite vow. And no, he kept the law. Do you guys see the problem here? They err on both sides. They're missing. It's covenant language. We don't have to make it up anymore. And that is the key of decoding these verses. So let's do a covenant review real quick. We covered this in great detail. That's why we did 2 intros of part 1 and 2 to show you what a covenant is. The 1828 Webster's Dictionary definition of a covenant is a mutual consent or agreement of 2 or more persons to do or to forbear some act or thing, to enter into a formal agreement, to bind oneself by contract, guys. Grace doesn't free you from the contract. Grace actually makes you very, very, very much accountable to the contract, because now you have the highest position in the universe. You're a priest and a king to potentially be an heir of the kingdom and rule in a kingdom that has laws. And if you're a king and a priest now, before you die, this is your testing period if you're going to qualify for the kingdom that will follow the covenant, the contract that's coming. Make sense? It's all about the contract. Strong's number for covenant is Strong's 1285, Berit. It means treaty, alliance, agreement, or pledge. Guys, we could stop and talk about this for several hours. Look at those words. Treaty, alliance, agreement, pledge. Hopefully there's many verses that are popping in your mind right now. This is more than just laws. There's a heartbeat behind it. It isn't we're reading a dusty Bible or another religious group says this or that. Or here's a classic. I leave Christianity. It's all pagan. I leave and I go, all of that is not true. Well, who has everything wrong, right? But some of them, they have a strong allegiance as best they know. They perish for lack of knowledge, but they have a strong allegiance to the Savior. May have a lot of the issues wrong, but they give their lives away. Now on the Torah side, maybe you have a lot of laws, but you don't have any alliance to the Son, and you're not giving your life away. You're not following the back-breaking covenant instructions. Just read Luke 6 or Romans 12. Just read them in detail. Giving to everybody who asks. Turning the right side when somebody hits you on the left side. If somebody asks you to go 1 mile, you go 2 miles. You see, there's deep, sell everything you own and follow me. There's a deep alliance, a deep pledge with all your heart that consecrates a blood covenant. Now, it does come with instructions, absolutely, but the heartbeat behind it is not to constrain you or to confine you into all, Christian, I don't want to do any of those things, those laws, because Paul said so. These are freeing. They're out of love. He's got a covenant instructions for you to help you. But he also promised you eternal life. That's a pretty good deal, wouldn't you say? Now, on the other side, it has a contractual form. This is the root of all contracts. Modern-day contracts are directly from a blood covenant. We could go into modern-day weddings, modern-day contracts, and show you how they all come from this issue. Every contract has these elements. It has an offer. It has acceptance. It has terms. It has conditions. And it has consideration. Now, consideration means both parties must get something in return. Now, as it relates to covenant and the Father, and through his unending mercy and grace that he gave Abraham's descendants, even to let them hang on long enough where you and I are still around 2,000 years after the Messiah and 3,500 years after the golden calf and the sin of the 10 spies and them rejecting him as king and eventually worshiping all the other gods of the nations. Again, treaty, alliance, pledge. We don't do that no more because we're coming out of the nations. And it's part of our offer. It's part of our terms, part of our conditions. And guess what the consideration, guys? The Father only gets one thing in return, because what can we get him? We can't even build him a house. He says, look, heaven is my throne. Earth is my footstool. You're going to build me a house? The only consideration you can give him is your heart. That's all he gets in return. So a covenant is a contract, and the law, quote unquote, the law, that we read over and over again in Paul's writings of that covenant, is the agreement. Make sense? Whether it be first covenant or second covenant. Now again, Paul knew his audience. He's writing to a specific people. He's not reading to you. I'm sorry, you're worthy of being written to, but he didn't live 2,000 years after the Messiah. He lived in addressing the people that were in bondage to the law of Moses. And he was beaten for it, stoned, shipwrecked. He gave his life. If that breaks your heart that people think he's a false prophet, absolutely breaks your heart. If we'd only be worthy to be in Paul's shoes to do what he did, we're just worthy enough to get the revelation. One day he's the first guy I want to find and say, Paul, I did it. I figured out what you were saying. And he's been rolling in his grave for 2,000 years. People have butchered his writings and still butchering it. So terms equals the agreement. You see this on both sides. That's what law is. A covenant involves a relationship, like a marriage. A marriage, by the way, is bound by a contract, a set of statements to pledge your allegiance. Now, this is why this is so deeply mysterious as we're closing this study tonight. Deeply mysterious. And you're going to have to stick around for this detailed two covenant series. I imagine it's going to take at least 100 teachings to cover the whole thing. There's 8 covenants total. The first 7 were all part of the first covenant, and it was made through 5 individuals. This is of restoring the covenant. Adam fell. Remember, that's the whole story, Adam falling from the garden. First through Noah, then through Abraham, 2 covenants through him. Please watch part 1 and 2. We cover this in detail, the big picture. Now, many people say the Mosaic covenant or the Sinaitic covenant. Boy, have they made an error in that statement. That statement. The problem is there's 3 covenants, and one of them wasn't even at Mount Sinai. So you can't say the Sinaitic and you can't say the Mosaic unless you know what Mosaic means. And then the final covenant with David. This, guys, is the first covenant. 1 through Noah, 2 through Abraham, 3 through Moses, 1 through David, 7 total covenants. And then the renewed covenant. That word new actually could be translated as renewed. Kadash in Hebrew, as Jeremiah 31:33, is proclaiming the prophetic renewed covenant. Now, please watch our series and the series upcoming. It'll be teaching from every detail we have been revealed, plus hopefully more the Father will add, and plus any of you servants out there that would love to join us and add to the revelation that you would get that we aren't seeing and how this meticulously breaks down. I promise you'll never want to turn back to abstract understanding again. And this is our upcoming teaching series. So, as we close here, in the beginning was Adam, right? Genesis 1 and 2 is the contract he had. The Father gave him. He broke it. He broke that covenant. The contract instructions were pretty simple. Just don't eat of that fruit. And guard. Guard means keep. Like keep our commandments of John. John 14:15 says, if you love me, keep my commandments. It's the same concept. Keep is shamar in Hebrew. Guard. And he didn't guard the garden. He broke the covenant. And as we showed you this screen in part 2, you have to view this as an unfolding story. It's the only way the pieces fit. It's actually, as hopefully we showed you, it's the only way to make sense of the scriptures. There's no way. And so many people can't do this. And I beg people to follow my understanding of how this works. Because, again, people leave Christianity, they think, oh, that's dispensationalism. It can't be true. It's all pagan. That's Christian. Wait a second. People living to be 1,000 years old? There wasn't a different dispensation? Why did the Messiah come and die on the stake anyway? That's not a dispensation? See, they don't see there's a new sheriff in town. And hopefully that hits your soul in a heavy way. You have to see it this way. It's the only way it works. And by the way, it's just simply true. So in the beginning, you have Adam. He a little bit more far-reaching. Now, this is the covenant he broke. Now, I want you to visually see this. Look down the road, further down the road. We're going to fill in the gaps as you're looking at the road. I call this the covenant road. Now, Noah's a little bit further down the road. He began the covenant restart through Noah, piece by piece. Then with Abraham, he called a man out of Babylon. Then he eventually entered a covenant with himself by himself. The Messiah died for that. That's the will with Abraham. Then Moses came. This is now, guys, you can see this visually. It took 430 years to happen while they're in captive in Egypt. All the terms and conditions that the Father already said was going to happen to Abraham's descendants. Oh, by the way, when he didn't have any descendants, that's pretty important. He actually bound it by blood covenant, guaranteed Abraham it would happen this way, and sure enough it did. At the fulfillment of the covenant promises with Abraham, came Moses the deliverer to bring forth Abraham's descendants. The problem is there was only supposed to be one covenant in completion of that, the book of the covenant. There was an alternative, and then the book of law. We covered that. There were 3 total covenants through Moses, 2 of them through disobedience, 1 more through David, again through disobedience, but he turned it into a blessing for one man, David. These covenants were exclusive to the people and the parties therein. And this phrase, my covenant, whether you're talking about Isaiah's day, David's day, Moses' day, Abraham's day, or even Noah's day, the phrase, my covenant, is 76 times in the New King James Version. That phrase in itself in the Old Testament, no matter which of these covenants you're talking about, you know why? Because it was his covenant. There's only one of him. And because men don't live to be as old as the Father in heaven, they die. He extends his covenant through other people to the point that he eventually had to come and die for it, to actually make it the better covenant based on better promises with a new sheriff in town from the order of Melchizedek, to renew that first covenant at Mount Sinai with Abraham's descendants. Again, we'll cover this in great detail soon. So the covenant in place determined man's requirements, no matter when they lived. And thus the background for every single scripture any author wrote, the writers absolutely knew the covenant they were living under. The problem in our day, nobody sees how this all fits. And if you're watching this either on video right now, on recording, if you're watching it live, we are so blessed to be able to deliver this to you, and you are so blessed to be able to see how the Father did this. I pray you can continue on with us, because this is the most beautiful painting you'll ever want to see, as I'm just the Father's servant, doing my best as the painter, trying to paint this beautiful picture. As we wrap this up, you can see Adam in the beginning, and you can see how this took 4,000 years to come as the Messiah had to come as the seed of the woman, and he had to pay for Abraham's breaking of the covenant. The devil, Satan himself, got dominion over the world. Adam forfeited over to him. Now, the second Adam came, and he rose from the dead. He destroyed the works of the devil for those who do not sin. 1 John 3:8 says, for this is the purpose the Son of Elohim has manifested, that he has destroyed the works of the devil. He who has the seed within him will not continue to sin. That's so we don't sin. So he's going to bring forth a people obedient in the same way Adam was disobedient, kicked out. So the prior 7 covenants, as you looked at that road unfolding, now we're zooming out to a big picture, what it looked like over that 4,000-year period, more specifically, I should say 3,000-year period to David, Noah, Then the covenant guaranteeing land to Abram, the promises. These were unconditional blood covenant promises to Abraham. And then seed in 3. The 10 commandments given for the first time as a covenant, bound by covenant. The book of the covenant, they break that within 40 days of Moses going up and down the mountain. That was the original plan. By the golden calf. Covenant 5. This is the mysterious key to unlock the entire puzzle. The second set of stone tablets, which, by the way, was also the 10 commandments. But it just was different. It wasn't blood ratified. It came with a sacrificial system. It was temporary. It had some good laws, of course, because it's a priesthood. The kingdom is still run. It's just by an alternative priesthood, the Levites. 40 years, within 6 months, I think it's about 6 months later, the bad report came. He then had enough of that first generation. He then said their bodies are going to die in unbelief. We're warned, by the way, in Hebrews chapter 3 and 1 Corinthians 10 to not be like them, because we can read about their stories of what they did. That's why Christmas and Easter and certain events are certain abominations, because there's other gods that's being twisted. We've been lied to. Do your research on that. Covenant number 6, which we covered in great detail, which is also one of the keys, incredibly important, to specify what is the book of the law. Covenant 6. This was in effect for this period of time up until the leading of and the death, burial, and resurrection of the Messiah, the giving of his Spirit on Shavuot, on Pentecost, to institute a renewed covenant in his blood, renewing the first plan. Can you see the red? You see the red covenants, 2, 3, and 4. He renewed that initial plan. Let me show you this and how 5 and 6 are added together. These are the words of the covenant which YAHUHA commanded Moses to make with the children of Israel in the land of Moab. That's where Moses is standing. Moses is in Moab, which is on the edge of the promised land to Abraham. After 40 years, he's going to die, though. He's not going to be able to go in. He hands the book of the law to Joshua. We read that in Deuteronomy 31. He anoints Joshua. Okay? Now, this is to the second generation, not the first generation. They died, remember? 20 years and older. Look at this. The covenant in Moab. Where's that? That's where Moses is standing. Covenant 6. It's added to, in addition to, the covenant at Horeb. That clearly is the second set of stone tablets at Horeb or Sinai, the second time Moses went up. These were added together. But now, they then eventually were even more disobedient. They reject him as king. The father enters a covenant with David to give him the kingship. And that, guys, is the summary of what we have just learned tonight. I pray this has been a blessing to you. This is the end of the first half of part 3. Part 4, guys, be prepared, because we're going to talk about the blood of the eternal covenant, the covenant that you bound yourself, you owe your life to, but he promised you the inheritance of Abraham for those that will follow him. And again, in this future upcoming series, this is actually, I want to remind you, possibly before you watch the second part, is please go to our covenant study to cut a blood covenant. We have access to that on our line. Reach out to us. Please watch us. You'll see the gravity of an ancient blood covenant. It is so important. So, Father, bless you guys. Thank you for joining me tonight. And I pray that this has illuminated your understanding at great, great, great depths.